Thank you. Can you hear me okay? All good. Bon appetit. Okay, great. Wonderful. So greetings of love and peace be upon all of you, all my relations. I am so grateful to be invited to give this talk on the unceded territory of the Musqueam First Nation. And I hope that this presentation today will serve as a humble contribution to the ongoing work on decolonizing the planning profession, right? Woo! And to honor the survivors of the residential school and support the ongoing efforts towards truth and reconciliation. And I want to start my oh, by the way, do any of you know what this is behind me? It's a salmon bouquet, yeah, in like a beautiful bouquet. So it's a picture from Lynn, who is one of our citizen scientists, and I just thought, it's so beautiful. I'm happy to take this any day over like cut flowers. So just a hint for gifts and stuff like that. So let me go to the next slide. I can maybe this way, which way? Is it going? It's not moving. But anyway, I would like to start by sharing a message. Yeah, it's frozen, eh? Oh, there you go. Okay, wonderful. I would like to start by sharing a message and a teaching that I learned from Dr. Malani Goodchild. She is from the Biktigong, Nishnabik, and Kitagon-Shibi First Nation, and she guided the Food Systems Lab at its inception, and she taught me that food is medicine. So back in 2016, she guided the entire lab team and the participants in a blueberry ceremony, which was absolutely beautiful. So after saying prayers from one bowl, we all shared blueberries, and she reminded all of us that these blueberries are our relations, and that we are all meant to share, even if it's from one bowl. And she also said, you know, what does it mean like when we hold a worldview that land and plants and animals are relations? Especially when we consider that, you know, this kind of worldview is a challenge to the commoditization of our planet and each other. And because of this, and because of her and the work of many elders and other colleagues, this is the inspiration for this study. So we have a lot to cover, but I know there's a class at 1:15, so I'll try to talk fast. So if I'm too fast, just tell me to slow down, okay? And on the agenda, I'm going to share a little bit about the lab for those of you who've never met me or known about our work. We're going to provide an overview of food system planning, because it's my, like, when I was a master's student at UFT, it was not a thing yet, but it was like my dream. It was my dream to be specialized in food system planning, to become a food system planner. So I hope I can share a little bit of that passion, and also share some ideas that can be applied to the planning profession. So Food Systems Lab is a collaborative lab, a social innovation lab, that, and we are passionate about co-designing, co-envisioning a food system that is equitable, sustainable, resilient, and that mitigates climate change. And we are women-led and interdisciplinary, so we are so excited to work with engineers, philosophers, you know, other social scientists from the humanities, you name it. And we are always happy to collaborate on work that contributes to food justice. So if any of you are interested in food justice work, send me an email, okay, and we can maybe chat. And I photoshopped that. I wasn't actually on the moon, just FYI, in case like this leads to further conspiracies or whatever. I'm from the Sundanese tribe of Indonesia, born and raised, a mother of 3 children, 4 chickens, and 1 cat. And I'm a very grateful earthling. And just in terms of how I situate myself in the world, my worldview is based on the teachings that I've received as a Muslim, and that's the concept of Tawheed. And Tawheed means that in my love of the beautiful, infinite creator, I also love humanity. It's like if you love the artist, you love the art, so I love the art. I believe that we are all connected and that we are meant to love one another. And I've been self-identified as a food system planner for 15 years now. And I work in the Global South and the Global North, including in Africa, especially Tanzania. If you're interested in Tanzania work, come reach out to me as well. And I work on various issues from school food. This actually, Claudia, I think you might have taken this picture. This is with children, and we're picking seaweed to be put in the garden. I do a lot of work on food waste. It's very glamorous, as you can see. I get to wear cool outfits. And then also I work on food in outer space. So that's something that I'm also interested in as well. You know, there might be an intergalactic planning division one day. You never know, right? So UBC. So those of you like here might be in housing planning, transportation planning, and other aspects of planning. But just kind of a brief overview. When I think about the food system, the accepted definition is a food system is the systems and infrastructure needed for food production, processing, packaging, distribution, consumption, and disposal, right? So you think of like food supply chain, you often think of like a farm and the processing center and the retail and the compost and all of that good stuff. But really in my heart, and I know that in the work that we do, food system is also about relationships. So relationships between the people that grow the food and harvest the food, relationship to the land, the water, animals, and planet. I know at UBC there's a lot of great scholars working on migrant workers' justice, for example, and I like to think about the food system as encompassing those relationships as well. Unfortunately, and this is a very sad situation, is that there's been a rupture in these relationships within the food system, especially in the dominant industrial extractive food system. As Indigenous authors Clarkson, Morissette, and Regalit argue, when we begin to separate ourselves from that which sustains us, we immediately open up the possibility of losing understanding of our responsibility and our kinship to the earth. And you can clearly see in this picture, and that's a picture that I actually see when I go on the plane and I see across the province of BC, like a lot of this from the top. And right now, what we're having in terms of like this rupture, we're thinking about that there's this growing perfect storm of food insecurity, of water insecurity and drought. I now live in Sunshine Coast, and I think last year there was a water restriction where farmers were not allowed to actually water their farm. You know, very, very frightening when farmers are not allowed to water their crops. Thankfully, they, changed that, but still, that's a very frightening situation. We have a wasteful, climate change inducing global economy heavily dependent on extracting fossil fuels without distributing the benefits equitably. And we have a world where growing tensions, frustrations, and clashes between nations, religions, cultures, identities are pitted against one another. And with growing poverty, food insecurity, water insecurity, conflict and energy instability, people being displaced through wars, and a future of climate refugees projected, right? Scholars such as Beddington noted that this can lead to a growing global conflict and potentially even global war. And I would love to think that I'm fear-mongering, but I'm actually not fear-mongering because the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists have set the doomsday clock. How many of you are familiar with the doomsday clock? Yeah, it's Google doomsday clock. It's very doom, like when you're doom scrolling, Google the doomsday clock, right? So it's like 89 seconds to midnight this year, which is the closest ever for our collective humanity to reaching a nuclear war, which, by the way, according to a study published in Science, a limited regional nuclear war can kill 5 billion people due to global, like not just from the initial impact, but also because of the famine that will cause by nuclear winter or abrupt sunlight disruption scenario. So abrupt sunlight disruption scenario. And although I work in the food system resiliency sphere, like right now, I'm working on building a report for the UN HLP team called Building a Resilient Food System, and I enjoy my work in food system resiliency. I hope I never have to see the day that we all have to forage for earthworms, apparently. Can foraging for earthworms significantly reduce global famine in a catastrophe? I hope we don't have to go there, right? So, in a nutshell, a lot of researchers are working on this area of research and in this like growing kind of like trend and critical need. But in a nutshell, we need all hands on deck. Planners especially need to have all of our hands on deck. And if it's not on the deck of a boat, maybe on the deck of like a terrestrial kind of deck of some sort. So In 2000, US planners Dr. Kami Patakuchi and Dr. Jerome Kaufman identified the gap in food systems knowledge in their seminal planning article. And for those of you in grad school, you might know about this, this particular article. It's very, very seminal. And what they found is that really, the food system is notable by its absence from the writing of planning scholars, from the plans prepared by planning practitioners, and from the classrooms in which planning students are taught. And I remember reading this as a grad student, and so this was in 2000, and 21 years later, our amazing colleagues at KPEU did a survey. I don't know if you've seen this report before, but there was actually a survey of Canadian planners, 435 planners, and they found that 67% of planners never took a food-related course. So I know UBC is very strong with food, but like this is something that, you know, nationally we don't necessarily have like very good, like a harmonized or like a kind of an understanding of the importance of food system planning throughout planning schools. And it also they found that the top 5 knowledge gap amongst planners is how planning impacts the food system. So there are a lot of planners out there that are practicing that they don't understand how their planning work actually impacts or influences the food system. That's pretty sad, right? Also, Indigenous food systems is identified as a knowledge gap by 48% of planners. So there's a lot of work to do, and I think this is an opportunity for planning schools and for SCARP, for example, to all of us, we need to collectively work together to change the statistics, because this is 20-something years, 25 years after the Patakuchi and Kaufman article, and the situation seems still, you know, still kind of bleak. And if COVID was not enough of a wake-up call for all of us to think about our food supply, the recent tariff threats, like apparently it's supposed to go through, like, you know, in what, a few weeks or so. So that is starting to get people to think more about where our food is coming from, who is growing our food, and why we are so dependent on the US. Now I'm going to the grocery stores and I see all the Canadian flags everywhere, right? Like, you're like, what is that? Like, oh, it's Canadian, like, buy Canadian. So this kind of like understanding, realization of like, oh, maybe we shouldn't just take things for granted. It's just starting now. And the thing is, when planners ignore food systems, our communities will be more vulnerable to disruptions, particularly if our idea of food system planning is mainly focused on investing in and creating more opportunities to just scale up or have more supermarkets, like the regular multinational supermarkets. And I think about kind of food system planning and how often people think that food system planning equates to kind of this idea of tackling the issue of food deserts. Like, probably you all know about food deserts, right? But food deserts is, so basically food deserts refers to urban neighborhoods where residents have little or no access to stores and restaurants that provide fresh, healthy foods, and most often lower income households are the ones that are more susceptible for having the lowest accessibility to supermarket access. But as food activist Karen Washington critique, food desert is not really the correct or accurate terminology. She has argued, and many have argued, that food apartheid is more accurate concept to describe the situation. Deserts are natural. Deserts actually have a lot of biodiversity. Food desert does not explain the really systemic and structural racism, marginalization, and discrimination in planning policies that result in people and certain groups of people having more food insecurity. And so this is why, like thinking about the underlying root of systematic racism, thinking about the lack of food system planning concept or content being discussed in planning school, and also the fact that food system planning is a top 5 knowledge gap in the planning world. We basically worked along with amazing colleagues and partners, including the Kitselas Nation, on the Our Home, Our Food, Our Resilience project, including with a colleague in UBC, Dr. Jeanette Bulkin, if you know of her work. And so the reason why we did this project is because we know that the colonial and dominant approach to addressing food security and food system planning, it's just not working. And we need to dig deeper. We need to decolonize our idea of food and our food system. And so this is why we applied to SSHRC and got funding. And so the project that we did is based on case studies in Kitselas, in Port Alberni, if you've ever been to Port Alberni, and then also in Vancouver. So if you go to our website, you will be able to download and check out all of these books, and feel free to share it with your colleagues. And it kind of like was conceptualized based on this idea of food asset mapping and food assessment in general. In food system planning, there's like this concept called community food assessment, or food assessment that policymakers or planners would do. In Vancouver, there's a food asset map. In Burnaby, there's one. In New Westminster, and there's many, many cities and communities that are developing, a food asset map. And food asset map is usually focused on the built environment, and it gives less consideration to the natural environment and social assets. And also, it often does not provide the context of whether or not those assets, if they do exist, are accessible or inclusive. So there's like really there's often no context about that. So food asset, basically, for those of you who might be like, what? What's food asset? It's not like the typical kind of anyway, let's get into it. So food assets include I go into tangents sometimes, often. So food assets include the local food infrastructure that maintains food secure communities and regions. And it includes farm, processing, and distribution capacity, food enterprise, markets, retailers, community gardens, urban farm, community kitchens, student nutrition programs, emergency food distribution, community food organizations, and centers. And this is from Lawrence Baker's work. But the thing is, what we need to remember from all of this is that the content of food asset maps, it really depends on who contributes to the process of identifying and categorizing said assets. And there is a potential for many of these maps to neglect important food assets depending on who was at the table, right? Okay. So is there a consensus? No, there's really no consensus when it comes to food asset. And in fact, there's like a gap in peer-reviewed literature on the topic. And because of this, it's really important for us to think about, well, okay, when it comes to like food assets that are important for communities, what are they? How do they look like? How do they look like depending on your identities or your background and your income? And so these are just some of the kind of like the literature search that we did. And then another thing also is this concept called map tyranny, and this is a concept identified by Duncan. And this is wherein the scientific worldviews of the map makers and scientists are privileged while other worldviews are neglected. Jakes and colleagues also identified how underlying values shape how assets are defined. And then so the first step to actually trying to understand food asset map is to clarify underlying values. And I think what's really important in all of this is like understanding also the power inequalities amongst the participants. And one thing I wanted to kind of caveat, I forgot to put it here. In our Vancouver case study, some people felt uncomfortable with the concept of asset because asset has a capitalistic connotation, and when you have a relationship with food and the land and other relations as like kin, asset seems to be kind of problematic. So I forgot to put that caveat that there is a need to kind of also understand the problem with the word asset. And just a quick thing, this is one of the examples of a food asset map that was developed by an undergraduate student of mine for Burnaby and New Westminster. As you can see with this, it's up to you to develop the categories. It's up to you to also like put, what are the different like icons and like what are considered assets. But one of the things that might be like something that we need to interrogate further is, are you doing this as a wayfinding exercise? Are you doing this as like a way to just kind of list things, but then what happens if things kind of disappear or go out of business? Like there's so many kind of problems when you actually like implement the food asset mapping exercise that kind of like, questions like, okay, so what is this for really? Like what is the purpose of all of this? So because of this, we worked in Kitselas Nation, and in the context of our project, this project is like we would consider this a community-led project because it was inspired by the Kitselas Nation's missions. So the nation has several missions here in their community comprehensive plan that ties into our project. Mission 4, for example, is to acknowledge the harmful effects of historical wrongdoings and trauma on the health of our people and work together to heal and create our own future and safe, healthy, prosperous community. Mission 6 is to respect and take care of our elders and celebrate them, and then also to support and share their knowledge on traditional ways and teachings and stories, and also to honor and invest in teaching the youth. And I think that's very, very important, and that has influenced our research. And also in terms of I just want to say, the title of my presentation is Indigenizing Food System Planning. I want to say that this comes from a place of knowing that Indigenous people have done food system planning forever, right? This might be a new thing in the kind of more dominant planning profession, but it's not a new thing for Indigenous peoples. And as my colleague, Dr. Chelsea Armstrong noted, Kitselas Nation has been involved in food system planning, including the stewardship and tenure over important marine, riverine, and terrestrial food pre-colonialism. So this idea of like planning and food system planning and indigenizing food system planning, this is basically a way to really uplift and showcase the work that has already been done, but is still unknown in the planning profession. In Kitselas Nation, I don't know, how many of you have been to Terrace? Yes, you have? It's really beautiful. I absolutely love it. And Kitselas Nation, their territory spans from the middle of Skeena River to the marine waters on the Pacific Ocean. And today, more than 300 community members live in and near the city of Terrace, including on reserve, with some 400 other members in urban areas around Canada and the world. So about 700 members with the Kitselas Nation. And so because of all of the different gaps in food system planning literature and because of the interest in the leadership of the Kitselas Nation in trying to better kind of highlight the important community assets in the community food assets, we came up with these following research questions. So the first one is, can the Photovoice process led by the Kitselas people better identify food assets and infrastructures that have otherwise been overlooked? If so, how? And can practice theory help inform planners about factors that can support the continuance of Indigenous cultural food practice? If so, how? Just a quick, how many of you apply practice theory in the work that you do? No? Okay, good. Yeah, something new. Cool. Okay, so we took a citizen science approach because I think it's important for myself and my colleague and my team to recognize the scientific work done by the community and their expertise on the food system. And so these are citizen scientists, and citizen science research is basically a method that relies on non-kind of traditionally trained scientists to collect that data. And we also applied a Photovoice method. How many of you have done Photovoice, maybe? So, okay, awesome method. Just like check it out, love it. So Photovoice uses photography and then mix that with key informant interview or storytelling. And this has the opportunity for the citizen scientists to counter stereotypes, to empower participants, and to also provide dissemination strategies to influence policymakers and stakeholders. And in terms of the methods, so the citizen scientists were paid $26.58 per hour, which is like the livable wages for BC. And they were paid for 30 hours for photography, for training, for the meetings. And then the Photovoice interviews were conducted from September 2020 to June 2021. And this project took way longer because community engaged research often takes longer anyway, but with COVID, and then suddenly we were not allowed to go there, it was like at that point, like Zoom is kind of like a new thing, right? Like, it's like, what, Zoom? Oh, okay, we're like, it's completely new. And we had to like learn everything, learn how to do community engaged research on Zoom. And so that was a bit challenging. But basically the participants were asked, the citizen scientists were asked to come up with 10 photos per themes based on practice theory. And then we followed up with the interviews and the recruitment of the participants, the citizen scientists, apologies, were done with the partnership of the Kitselas Lands Use and Resource Department. And okay, social practice theory. So this is really exciting, and I really hope that I can make this theory easy to understand because I think it's very useful for planners. It's often used by sociologists. And so basically, social practice theory seeks to understand everyday practices through the interaction of the following 3 factors. And then so the first factor is material. So when you think of material, think of places, spaces, tools, infrastructure, right? So this classroom is a material, for example. The compost bin is a material. Like so places, spaces, infrastructures, like material stuff. And then meaning are the worldviews, the values, faith, like spirituality, like all of that. And then the third factor is competence. So competence relates to skills and knowledge and training and all of that good stuff. And so material, meaning, competence, and how they weave together helps us understand why people do the things they do on their everyday food practices, basically, in a nutshell. And then we added a 4th theme, which is aspirations, because I think as planners, we want to know what do you aspire, what do you want in your community. And so let's just give an example from this kind of picture, and this is a very cute picture from Lynn Wright Parker. So behind we have a salmon camp, and so that's the material. The meaning is like salmon has a very deep meaning for the community. It has a spiritual meaning. It's so important for their identity. And this is why investing in the competence or the skills and the educations of the children is so important, so that they have the same kind of connection and love and also stewardship for the salmon. You see how the material, meaning, competence collide? If we took away the salmon camp, if we took away the materials and the tools and the infrastructure, it's hard to kind of like apply your motivations and your meanings and your competence. But then if you don't have the salmon camp, you don't have the competence. You might have like a little bit of the meaning from like generational kind of like, sharing, but not the practical skills. That's why it all combines together. And so here are the wonderful citizen scientists. So we have Desiree Bolton, Clarissa Spencer, Darren Bolton, Leanne and Fred, and Lynn Wright Parker. And just to let you know, with Photovoice methodology, it is generally recommended that you have between 7 to 10 participants. We had 7, but one unfortunately had to drop out. But it's okay. We're just like short one, but that's just one of the limitations. So just to let you know that it's not meant to be like a giant kind of like scale up study. It's good to have it small and deep. And so let's talk about material, the first theme, places and spaces. And so related to the theme of material, food spaces such as the Skeena River, the smoke houses to preserve fishing, also like the fishing points and the berry harvesting areas. These were all identified by the citizen scientists as important. And for DESI, the Skeena River and that area around it, it's more than just a place to get food. It's a place for community to come together. It's a place to harvest and process ulikins. And ulikins is like a type of, they call it like a candlefish. It has a lot of grease and it's very, very good, and it's also good for the winter. And so this is where they process ulikins together. So I think it's important for planners, for example, to think about a place and a space. Well, we kind of know this, not just as like a material physical thing, but also that there's like so many embodied meaning to it. And this is a perfect example. So the smokehouse, like so many of the citizen scientists mentioned, the smokehouse, the smokehouse, the smokehouse. This is an important food asset. Obviously, it's not in the food asset maps of many, right? Like, so we wouldn't know that unless we actually discuss this with Indigenous experts like them. And so, for example, with Fred, he mentioned how going to the smokehouse is like a really great way of thinking about his grandmother and for intergenerational learning. And smokehouse is like, it's a place of love, right? So I think this is really important because, again, something like understanding the embodied values and meanings within the place. And as you can tell, when I'm talking about the meaning, although I'm kind of like categorizing them into material, meaning, and competence, it really weaves in together. And then just to give you a sense of like kind of the opposite of the traditional, so Clarissa talks about her love for asparagus, and you can only get asparagus. Well, I mean, you can probably grow up asparagus here, but it's a bit harder to grow it in terrace, I think. But it's so expensive to get asparagus in the supermarket. And in terrace in particular with the supermarkets, she shared about how often the shelves are bare or empty, especially when they're waiting for new shipment. Sometimes the food has gone already bad. And so I think it's important in the context of especially remote communities, but even increasingly in urban communities when we think of disruption, how reliance on just like the modern industrial supermarket is really insufficient. And then the second theme is meaning and values, and this is like something that I just love so much. So many Indigenous worldviews reinforce the belief that humans do not manage the land, but instead manage their behaviors and relations to the land. And I think that this is like so clear with Darren's story. And so this is a picture of the octopus. It's not really clear in this image, but if you see the book, it's just really beautiful. And as Darren said, this is royalty food to me, to my people, because it's hard to come by and they're smart. And we have so much respect for them. And I was taught when I was a kid not to celebrate the death of the food that we harvest. And then at the end, he was taught that, you know, you honor the octopus because he died so you can live. And I just remember, like, I think, Claudia, we were in Haida Gwaii, and how some people, the way that they harvest octopus, not the Haida communities, but others, like settlers, they would actually put bleach in the water. And yes, that kills the octopus, but it also kills everything else. And so, you know, the way that octopus is harvested with humility, with respect, and in a way that understands like their intelligence and their crucial role in the ecosystem. Another theme, and so this relates to kind of space, is about taking only what you need. And so as Lynn mentioned, we take only what we need. So when we fish for our whole family, my parents, my sister, my two brothers, but nothing more, nothing less. And it was interesting because there were other stories from the other citizen scientists of how, you know, when they were looking for herring eggs, there was another community in, I believe it was Bella Bella, and although the community there got a higher offer for the eggs, basically they said like, no, we're not going to just like sell it because of a higher offer. We care more about relationship. And so there's this concept of enough. And this concept of enough is so important because I think that often nowadays it's hard to understand what is enough, right? 10 minutes, okay, perfect. And then the third theme, and this is another passion of mine because I have 3 kids and I really hope that, you know, my kids can learn about, you know, the Indonesian culture, the Indonesian dishes, and also my husband who's like Lebanese. So like a lot of kind of this like mixed culture, food, cuisine, and also like expertise. And so here, the third theme around competence is tied to the fish camp, which Leanne actually and Fred runs in the community. And so here, there's a picture of this beautiful child doing it's called the sal, T-S-A-L, like saling a fish. And so Leanne said the community members participating got a taste of the part of the process in the salmon camp. They learned how to make the strips. If you wanted to get a true taste, then you should actually stay from like the beginning all the way into the end. And I think like a lot of what's happening when it comes to these very important educational opportunities are done from love and from just kind of like volunteers and champions, but there is a lot of opportunities to actually invest more and support these educational opportunities. And here, Desiree shared about how about the violent rupture that was caused by residential schools and how that really destroyed the intergenerational connection and learning and connection to also like traditional food. She shared how it was very interesting for her to come to the community and see that many of the community members did not practice the traditional ways, and she realized that the reason why she knows the things that she knows and is because her father didn't actually go to residential school because he was hidden by his grandparents. And so so she talked about how it was kind of like jarring, and like why, for her to realize, like, that's why there is such a disconnect. And this is a picture that she took of a bunchberry, and this is a native plant from BC, and it's supposed to be very delicious. I've never tried it, but yeah, bunchberry. And then finally, the last theme. So the last theme of aspiration is not connected to practice theory, but I think it's very connected to planning in general. And so it's about the aspirations for the future of food. And here Lynn talks about how, these access to berry picking spaces and others, it facilitates family bonding. It facilitates strengthening community ties and creates spaces of belonging. And believe it or not, you probably look at this and you think, like, what's that? Like capers or something? This is huckleberries. And they're the most giant huckleberries I've ever seen in my life. They they look like giant huckleberries. And what Lynn does is she would just take enough, and then she would preserve them, or put them in jars and preserve them so that she can eat it throughout the year. And I think that's really awesome. For Fred, the aspiration for the future is kind of filled with a lot of fear and concern as well, because of climate change and how that's impacting the community. Fred noted that the water is warming, that's impacting the salmon's habitat, is also impacting the salmon flush. And so his wish for the aspiration is so that we can all work together, including planners, to remedy climate change. So I know you all have a very strong climate institute and all of that good stuff. So yeah, we need all hands on deck to support. And I hope we can make Fred's aspiration come true. And then the final thing from Desiree is for planning, especially at the School of Resource and Environmental Management at SFU, we work a lot with understanding kind of stewardship, economic development activities, resource extraction. And what Desiree noted is that because there is so much going on in the community with regards to mining companies, resource companies, there's a lot more disturbance with the wildlife, coyotes, wolves, moose. And so one thing that she hopes for the future is that the younger generation still gets to go out to the land, that that the animals will not, that there will be limits and balance with the current activity and resource extraction, and so that the future generation can continue traditional food practices. And so finally, just to share with you that we not only publish the book in hard copy for the community and for the nations and the groups that we work with, but we also had an exhibit at Science World for several months at the front. And so what we were so happy about was that the community members from Kitselas were able to go to Vancouver Science World and check out their exhibit and know that their work is being valued and has informed the work that's being done right now with their upcoming plan. And to conclude, I think one thing that I think we're almost done, right? Yes, we're almost done. Yes, 5 minutes, 4 minutes. Okay, there's a lot of conclusion here, and my mouth is really dry. But I think we need to understand as planners that historically, and even until now, Indigenous forms of knowledge have either been misrepresented, downplayed, or excluded in Western planning practices and documents. And so the hope from this study is to recognize, to get the planners to understand the importance of centering Indigenous voices. It's also important to invest and support Indigenous-led place-based learning, especially land-based learning, salmon camps, providing kids with opportunities to go out into the water, for example, that's what's happening in Terrace. And then also for food asset mapping or community food assessment in general, I think it's important to really question and double question and triple question, who is at our table, right? So if we don't, then what's going to happen is that we're going to miss a lot of important sites, important ecological, social, and community food infrastructure and natural infrastructure that can contribute to well-being. And Photovoice, I really recommend, especially grad students, PhD students, to really delve into Photovoice, because if you're passionate about community engaged work, this is a really friendly method that really excites the citizen scientists that participate in it. I can't tell you how many times I've been approached by previous citizen scientists who are like, can we do another Photovoice project? Like, it's so exciting. And then they get into photography, and then, you know, they have their work featured and published. And then it's like pictures are worth 1,000 words. But then at the same time, it also kind of like sparks this storytelling piece when you have the picture, and it just gets people really, you know, up for talking. So definitely check it out. And for planners, practice theory is very, very helpful, because I do a lot of work on consumer behavior. And often when we think about consumer behavior, we think about raising awareness, education, but then the infrastructure piece is kind of left out. The tools piece are left out. And this is where planners can play an important role. So social practice theory has been really helpful for us to understand how expertise and meanings and values and material infrastructure kind of weave together. And so I'm very interested in the development of a more just food system. And this is just like one piece of the puzzle. And hopefully, you know, we can do more and collaborate some more. So check out Food Systems Lab. You can download this book. And that's my email if you're interested in reaching out. And I think that's it for me for now. Thank you so much.
So my first question is, did this work reach out or bring some, generate some conversation at a decision-making level at the community? It's kind of a follow-up question after this work done. And the second question is like, the Photovoice methodology, I am trying to imagine how can be engaging with all-fashion decision makers. Sometimes the government, when we apply, for instance, for grants, they want us to report in a X way, not allowing us to bring with creative ways or more engaging ways with the community member. So I am trying to imagine a Photovoice methodology bringing to the decision maker table. How can be perception?
Yeah, that's really, really, really great questions. One thing that I wanted to mention is that because the Kitselas Nation in 2005 basically signed an agreement that they have full autonomy over their reserve, they actually have full autonomy, so it's not a federal crown land. And I think that's important because the people that are there, the leaders there, are very, very much like progressive and interested in this kind of like creative work. And if you check their community comprehensive plan, it is absolutely breathtakingly beautiful. So the kind of communication and ways of writing even policy papers is very different than what we typically, you know, kind of like do, like are familiar with in terms of like just a planning kind of document. What we did is to make it very accessible, we actually did an article for the community, for the Nations magazine. And so we did like multiple approaches. We did like a gallery, we did the legacy book, we did the report, the journal article. We wrote the journal article with the land use department. And so this is a way basically for the Department of Land Use to say, here's some evidence-based research in the journal of, like, you know, in a planning journal. And so that was very helpful. And another thing actually is because for the city of Terrace, in a review of their kind of food policy section, basically only 2 out of like the over 20 food kind of like oriented goals are even connected to Indigenous food planning at all. So this is actually like this material is very useful in terms of kind of like showing these are some of the things you can do, because 2 out of 23 for, you know, is just completely insufficient. And then in terms of the kind of like ongoing work, we have an ongoing work like that kind of like is rooted from this study on supporting land-based learning, especially the salmon camp and all of that. So there is kind of continuity, and that's like my hope. Our project was severely disrupted. We had like a whole idea and a whole plan to like be on the ground, work with policymakers, like but with COVID and how close the community was, that did create a disruption. But it's ongoing and it's and continuing. So hopefully we can do even more. Yeah. Thank you so much for that question. Great. Any other question? Yes?
Just a question about it. So, like the opportunity to sort of implement these things at the urban level, like food sovereignty for folks that maybe aren't living like in their home nation, but living in urban settings. I don't know if you like looked into that.
Yeah, so we have why we designed the project to have like an urban component, and then kind of like a more northern indigenous focus, and then also like an island component. And we did that on purpose because of like just the different ways that people reach food. And so in the Vancouver case study, you will see, if you download the Vancouver case study legacy book, there are Indigenous citizen scientists in the Vancouver book that whose hope, like for example, one, Leona Brown, I don't know if you've ever met Leona, she's so amazing. She's originally from Kitselas First Nation, which is in this area as well, but she lives here in downtown Vancouver, and she talks about the importance of like Vancouver Aboriginal Friendship Center Society for allowing her to get the traditional food, and then getting exposed to like some of the traditional practices and cultures, but also the importance of schools. When schools invest in like an Indigenous school food garden, that has allowed her to actually like bring in her children, and like because she might not have like access to like space in her apartment, but going to the school and involving her children in that kind of picking and all of that has been really phenomenal. So yeah, definitely check that out, and it's all free. Yeah, open access. Great. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Where did you say you did any work in, you said South America, or was somewhere in South?
Oh, Tanzania?
Tanzania, okay.
Yeah. Tanzania, Indonesia, and then I have some colleagues working on bioplastic packaging studies in Brazil. So yeah, anything food. I'm like the food gal. So downstream, upstream, middle stream, outer space. Yeah. Great. Thanks. Yes.
Do you know of any examples, or maybe the food system lab has done examples of merging food asset mapping with Photovoice?
Yes. Yeah, we did that. Unfortunately, like, you have to pay those subscription fee to like certain things, and like the funding is done. And so we lost that script. But I think we'll figure out a way to kind of archive that. What we did was we actually merged Photovoice with the typical like food asset mapping. We didn't do Google Map because it's just not like, it's not as pretty. But I think what's really useful from that is giving that context. So for example, some of the community members, citizen scientists that participate said that, okay, just because a food asset is there on the map, it doesn't mean that one, it's accessible for us, or that it's inclusive, or that it provides the kind of like food that we need, like culturally or whatever. So there is this tendency to look at a food asset map and see all of the dots and think like, oh, we have so much, like what's the point, right? We don't need to kind of like think deeper about like, underlying, root causes and stuff. But when you have the stories, and for example, I wish I had the picture here with me, but one of the citizen scientists in Vancouver shared a picture of a lineup where he basically would line up for hours to get to this soup kitchen. And sometimes he mentioned that when you get to the front, there would be no food left. Right? So from a technical standpoint, that asset is considered like it exists, but then people, it's like there's a lack of dignity in actually being able to access that food itself. So this is why like I think that this kind of like the behind the scenes story is so important, because or else we're just gonna be patting our back. We have the soup kitchen, oh, we have the food bank, but show us your ID in like 5 different documents, right? So yeah, problem. Yeah, thank you. Hi.
Very much your presentation.
Thank you.
I was wondering if social practice theories about the interaction between meanings,
material and competence,
knowledge, and aspirations. I was wondering what would be the key takeaway points with regards to the interaction of those thoughts.
Okay, that's really great. Actually, the aspiration piece is not part of the practice theory. That was like an add-on from just a planning thing. But so I work a lot on food waste. And so in food waste literature and in food waste policy, often the biggest thing is we need awareness campaign. we need to create awareness campaign, send people a bunch of flyers, get them sourced out to websites and everything. And then what happens is you have the values, you have the skills, but you actually don't have the material. So when we do this kind of practice theory research, we try to find the gaps where people might have values and might have skills, but then can't actually follow up on the desired outcome or the desired behavioral outcome because the tools or the materials are missing. So in the case of food waste, you might know that composting is good for you, that separating organic waste from non-organic waste is good. You might know how to do it, but then in your city, there's no composting facility, there's no composting infrastructure. And so then instead of me saying like, oh, government, to increase composting, you actually need to like blah, 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 like just educate them more, we actually can tailor down and get to the root of, we need more composting system, we need this, so it kind of like allows us to target interventions, whether it's like the meaning, the values that needs to be lifted up, the competence that needs to be lifted up, the material. Often the best kind of intervention is the one that weaves all three together. Does that help? Yeah. Yeah. Or else you have a value action gap. There's the value, there's a desired action, but then there's a gap in the middle where they can't translate. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, please.
Thank you so much for this presentation. That was amazing.
Thank you.
Tammara, right?
Yes.
Awesome. Talking about indigenous food sovereignty has a very political stance onto itself.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that when it's brought into the conversation, most people that are not aware of the difference between food security and food sovereignty will make a big point about being like, it's about food security and the rest is kind of useless. And that creates that big division of like, oh, okay, so we need to go like make cattle in the Amazon. Because that's literally it, right? Like
Okay.
There's a big focus on food security. So how have you found conversations bringing food sovereignty in a table, because I assume you sit in a few tables, about how to maybe perhaps like change the part that is like the meaning that people carry around with in relationship to food.
Yeah, that's awesome. Sometimes at the table, sometimes on the floor, sometimes in the forest, right? Like wherever we go to meet and to discuss, it's always great. So just to share, Malahat Nation, for example, has a food sovereignty, is developing a food sovereignty strategy. And I had the opportunity to be part of that with like a consulting firm. And I think what's really important that you want to remember when it comes to food security versus food sovereignty is in some of the indigenous communities, like you can have a supermarket right there, right? But maybe because of Department of Fisheries and Oceans regulations, you're not allowed to actually harvest the seafood, or even sometimes you're not even allowed to process, like say you have a moose, you're not allowed to process the moose or something like that in your area. And that's tied to the whole sovereignty piece, is that many of the communities do not yet have the sovereignty to be able to just do that. There are so many layers of bureaucracy. And so that's just an example of how communities are realizing that investing in just like more supermarkets or like just more of those kind of charity-based approach is not sufficient. And that the sovereignty piece will allow them to actually, utilize their lands the way that they do, practice their traditional ways of harvesting, the ways that they've always done, but have been disrupted and basically kind of like barriers upon barriers are created for them because of colonial rules. And so the communities are already moving forward to that direction, and this is why they're coming up with food sovereignty plans instead of a food security plan. Yeah, so yeah, it's exciting. Yeah. And just quickly, just to let you know, also like I think the exciting thing for many communities is the food sovereignty kind of alliance is international, with many indigenous peoples all around the world, and also with peasant workers all around the world. So there's a network, and that gives a lot of hope and excitement, and also allows for the sharing of resources. So it's like you're not alone, Yeah, so it's good. Okay.
If there's no further questions, I would just like to thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you
Dr.
so
Soma.
much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.